Amazing.
Hi everybody, and welcome to Regent Redux, our first event entitled Can You Do What You Love? It's presented by the Regent World and Christianity Today. I'm Paige Goodacre, and I'll be your moderator today, joining you from the Regent College Library here in beautiful Vancouver, British Columbia. I'm studying here at Regent College, working on a master's in theological studies, and we've got with us three wonderful panelists today: Andy Crouch, Rick Watts, and Josh Kwan. And in the next hour, we'll be discussing together questions of calling, vocation, and happiness. Questions like, what does it mean to do meaningful work? How can we make a difference in the world and also put food on the table? What does faithfulness look like? So we've got a lot of ground to cover, and I think it's going to be a really great conversation. So younger generations increasingly desire a meaningful job and a meaningful life. But that leads to the question, what is it that truly makes work meaningful?
Well, it's a great question, and I actually love the connection between job and life, and I think meaning in our work and in our paid work and our unpaid work and play, for that matter, all comes from the same basic source, which is to the extent that we are able to actually bear the image of God. When we actually, you could say successfully or faithfully, image the Creator, then I think we find meaning. When we don't, at least in the long run, we do not find meaning. So what does it mean for human beings to bear the image? Well, two words that have been very helpful to me are cultivating and creating. Cultivating being the sort of maintaining and caring for what is already good that's present in the world. So human beings don't come into the world in even a cultural vacuum. We have this image of the garden in Genesis 2. And the good world of Genesis 1, and human beings' first task is just to care for the world in all of its existing goodness. And then the second thing I think that makes work and life meaningful is to actually create in the world in the image of the Creator God, which is actually to take the beautiful, abundant, good resources of the world and create new things with them that unfold all the possibility that's latent in the world. When human beings arrive on the scene at the end of creation, at the climax of creation, there's all this possibility in the world that hasn't been unfolded yet. And as they work and live, generally, they unfold possibility. So keeping what's good, and then adding to the goodness of the world, indeed the very goodness of the world, by unfolding possibility, I think is the essence or the source of all the other things we find meaningful.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love this idea of unfolding possibilities. Can you tell me a little bit more of what that looks like on the ground in everyday jobs?
Sure. Let's see. When I think about everyday jobs, one basic thing human beings have to do is eat, right? So nourishment. I mean, in a sense, human beings share with every other creature the need for nourishment. So that's not a particularly human thing. But look at what human beings do with the resources that we've been given. First of all, most fundamentally, and this distinguishes us from all other creatures, we cook. Right? So any job that involves the preparation of food is a distinctly human activity. No other animal in any significant way applies heat to its food. And what that allows us to do is actually, by denaturing proteins and employing the Maillard reaction and all these other things that happen when you cook food, actually all this possibility that until human beings come along is just latent, is actualized. So, other animals eat maize or corn, I suppose, if it, to the extent that grains like that grow wild. But only human beings harvest it, crush it, mix it with water to form paste, and create, say, a tortilla or a tamale. And tortillas and tamales are the very goodness of the world sort of explored in a way that just corn is not in the same way. So every job is a job of some kind of transformation, ideally from the good original givenness of the world to very goodness, like corn to tamales.
And let's not forget fermenting as well.
And fermenting, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks for that example. I love this jobs that unfold possibilities and transform into something very good. Rick, would you jump in here and maybe add into this a little bit more? Help us unpack what is it that's distinctive about a biblical approach to work and meaning making?
Well, first of all, I just think what Andy was sharing is bang on the money. One other thing I might just add is that in the ancient world, when you formed an image, it was the image of a god, and what actually made it came alive was the presence of the indwelling spirit, the fiery breath of that god. That enabled the image actually to reflect the character. And it seems to me, actually, if I think about design and activity, a lot of design choices are expressions of the character of the designer. And so I think partly what makes work fulfilling is when we do what we do in ways that express God's character. And you can see some of that in Genesis, right? It's to bring order, it's for good, and it ultimately results in peace. One thing I'd add to that then, in terms of my kind of biblical perspective, would be the book of Ecclesiastes, I think, has some very interesting things to say about where we actually find our meaning. So Ecclesiastes recognizes there's a lot of great things in the world that we can enjoy, and it talks about even our creative abilities. So here I am, I've created this axe. Look at this, I've got this great axe. I can chop this tree, and then, oops, I've got a wood chip in my eye. Or I create this great digger, and I can make this hole, and then, whoops, I fall into it. And there's this perspective that says there's a lot of really good things in the world that give us life, but none of them are capable of actually sustaining us. And Solomon's got it all, and he goes through the list, including the food, and says, in the end, if this good thing becomes the ultimate thing, it ends up actually becoming meaningless. And I think that's because he wants to say human beings are more than just what's under the sun. There's a transcendence about us. So I think what Solomon wants to say is, as long as, and this is to pick up on Andy's point, if you understand what it means to be made in God's image, and you know the God in whose image you're made, that's the thing that prevents all this other stuff, including work, becoming, in the end, just meaningless and drudgery and just something you do over and over and over again.
Yeah, thanks for unpacking that for us, Rick, on meaning and work. Josh, I want to bring you into the discussion here, and maybe you can help me answer this question. We're talking about doing what you love. How is doing what you love different from doing what makes you happy, if at all?
I guess I tend to think of love and happiness slightly differently. So love may be something, it's you fall in love with someone. It's like a passion that burns long and deep. Maybe it's a long obedience in the same direction. It's a long obedience in the same direction, which means there's a commitment involved and it goes deep. I think happiness, some days you're happy, sometimes you're sad, right? And so you fall in love with someone, you get married, you're moving in the same direction for a long time, and then some days you're happy, some days you're sad. And in the context of work, you might think of work in maybe two dimensions. There's the sector or industry that you're working in. And there's a functional, everyday task that you're doing. And maybe that's, in the beginning it might be around data entry, answering phone calls, maybe eventually it's managing teams of people and setting strategy and direction for your company or nonprofit. And it would be fantastic to be able to love both the sector that you're working in as well as the everyday activities that you're doing. But in the meantime, I think you can really set the attitude of how you approach your work. And you can have an attitude of joy that exudes happiness. And I think that would be a fantastic thing. Like, no matter what you're doing and what field you're working in, if every day you decide to have joy to the workplace and move yourself into a direction where if first you're sacrificing exactly what you're doing because you're loving the industry, or maybe you're learning new skills, but maybe not in the same industry or sector that you want to eventually land in, you move in that direction where you can eventually find something that will bring you love, you'll find happiness in doing what you love.
I love that, by the way, Josh, because of the way it sort of distinguishes between happiness, which is so transitory, and there are actually all kinds of emotions involved in loving someone or something, you know, some of which are very happy, but others which are quite painful, quite intense, and all of those probably apply to any serious work, right? It's not, I'm so happy to be here every day, any more than parenting or loving my wife or you know, loving my church is not just happy, but it can be continually loving, even as you go through all those different emotions and feelings about that person or that community.
Yeah,
it's good.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I want to throw a question your way, Andy. Coming out of this idea of changing the world, a lot of young adults especially use the language of, I want to get out there, I want to change the world, I want to make a difference. And this seems to be true both for Christians and non-Christians alike. But how does this align with or differ from our biblical calling around ambition?
Well, I have good news and bad news, I guess, and then maybe an interpretation of both. The good news is every living creature changes the world in a very small way, because what it is to be alive is to participate in the transformation of your surroundings. That's one of the ways we know anything is alive. You're breathing oxygen in, you're exhaling carbon dioxide out, so congratulations, you're changing the world right now, wherever you are. And of course, even the smallest creatures do this. I mean, think about how when a baby comes into a room and their parents bring the baby in, everything in the room changes as people attend to that baby. So you probably will never change the world as much as you did when you were a baby, and you were so cute and so engaging. So you've already changed the world probably more than you ever will. The bad news is it's actually a terrible phrase for what we're aiming for, because the way it's usually used, it's used for this kind of comprehensive impact. It aspires to this worldwide, you know, impact that I don't think is realistic for any human being or any cultural act or even institution. In the most literal sense, nothing has changed the world in the sense of changing the horizons of possibility for every human being on the planet. Everyone's cultural activity has a limited scope. And in fact, even people who are tremendously celebrated and famous, even they are very conscious of the scope or the constraints on their ability to bring change. And I think that when we describe our ambition as changing the world, we're setting ourselves up for a kind of hubris that we're not meant for. You know, even the gospel itself has not changed the whole world. There are still parts of the world where the gospel hasn't been heard. There are many places where the gospel hasn't been believed and lived and made the transformation in society we hope for. So I really prefer we stay away from that and instead talk about being image bearers, which is both a more humble and in some ways more glorious thing than just making a lot of difference. And it's also something you can do at every stage of your life, no matter whether you're employed in a high visibility way or in a low visibility way. You can bear the image wherever you are. And then I do like to talk about making culture, that human beings' task and calling in the world is to add something to the world around them. But how much it changes, I just feel like we should not try to take responsibility for that or worry too much about that. It's so far beyond our control. Let's just bear the image and make culture where we are as we're given opportunity with the people we're given to be with, and let God handle the world-changing part.
Yeah. Let God handle the world-changing part. That's encouraging, actually.
Yes, it's very freeing, by the way. Like, oh my gosh, if you have to change the world, you're going to go crazy.
Yeah. I'd love to hear a little bit of each of your stories, actually. Maybe let's start with Josh. And Josh, from the 30,000-foot view, what could you tell us about your journey of work and calling, just in a minute and a half? Where has that taken you, and maybe what have you given up to do what it is that you're doing now?
Okay. So right out of college, I went to work as a newspaper reporter, and there's really no better job for a young person with a curious mind, with a little bit of ADD, right? So each day I had to become an expert in something new, and at the same time I also had a chance to spend 2 years writing about a family that was going through Alzheimer's in an early onset way, and I love telling stories. It's a great way to learn about the world and explore a lot of new things. I did that for 5 years, covered Silicon Valley, technology and business, cops and crime and court cases and murders, and Governor Schwarzenegger coming into California. Had a blast. Then I met my wife and got married and followed her to Chicago, and I had a couple years to kill because she was doing her residency there. I ended up in business school. I was on a track to help journalists figure out a way to cover their costs, right, in the face of internet and new challenges to our business model. And I was set to do that here, and that's my path. You asked about sort of cost. I think for me, it was really understanding that career and my work and my identity, guess what, it's not the most important thing. And that was around sort of really understanding how to honor my wife and love her and put her needs first. She didn't want to move to New York with me. And so I would have had a very unhappy wife in New York, so I said, okay, God, if I try to make my wife happy, find something for me to do that I won't be bitter at her for the rest of my life if I follow her back to California. That's a very selfish prayer, but it's very real and honest and raw, and trying to understand what it means to love someone above my own desires. And he came through, found something that was completely out of the blue, ended up in philanthropy. Did not expect to do that, but it opened a whole new set of doors for me, and I'm really blessed for it.
Huh.
Yeah, that's awesome. Newspaper reporter, business school, philanthropy. We've got some twists and turns here. I'm interested to know, from the different things you've done, have you found for yourself personally, is there a connection between doing work that you're loving, that you're well suited for, and being excellent at that work?
Well, it's easier to become excellent at something that you love, right? Because it gives you fulfillment and meaning. And so you want to hone those skills and get better at it. I think it's actually harder to become excellent at something you don't love, right? At something that you're sort of slogging through. And I think this is especially true for young people first getting started in their careers. They're often not glamorous jobs, right? But you're building a set of skills, and you're forced to do things that maybe you're not excited about. But when you show excellence at it, you're rewarded with more authority and responsibility and trust. And so I just say, be excellent at things that even though you don't like them, become really good at them, and those things will open more doors for opportunities that you'll eventually fall in love with.
Awesome. Rick, let's get to your story. Can you give us a similar 30,000-foot view of the things you've done and the turns that turns you took?
Yep, I started as an aeronautical engineer. I loved aircraft. I loved the kind of, as I said, poetry in motion. I loved the shape of them. That was a 4-year program, and we worked hard. We had about 30 hours of lectures a week, and then all the homework had to be done outside of those hours. So I think I learned some lessons about discipline. If you wanted to do well at this, there was no easy way. I was also learning drumming at the same time, and there's the older days. It looks easy, but underneath it, hours and hours of practice. And I just don't think there's any other way for that to happen, really. Even if you have natural gifts, they've got to be developed. So working in engineering, and as I was doing that and starting to encounter different people, I found myself getting interested in the world of ideas, and that eventually led me to do a degree in art history, sociology, and philosophy, doing that part-time, and basically decided, I think I'm interested in that more than the engineering. But I was very grateful for the engineering training, because it taught me how to analyze problems. If you hit a problem that you couldn't resolve, what you needed to do is disengage and take a step sideways and come back in again, reframing the question. And that's been really helpful in the field I now work in, actually. So did this work in humanities, ended up attending a different church that worked with a lot of people off the streets, actually. I met my wife, and we became house parents for people who were living rough or whatever. And in that setting, I realized, I really want to try and help people put their lives back together. And I think that helped me understand just how important actually the Bible was, that there was tremendous wisdom in this. And then I understood too that, well, you had to learn this thing. It's in Greek and Hebrew. You just couldn't walk into it, just like you can't walk into engineering. And that led then to doing a couple of master's degrees and then finally a PhD. And where I am now, I teach Bible at Regent, but I'm also part of the marketplace team. And I talk to people about how the Bible is actually about rhetoric and design. It's about transforming the world. which is why it looks like it does. It's not just about describing the world, it's about transforming it, which is what image bearers do. So it's been a great journey. I've really enjoyed it, and I love where I am at the moment. But I do have to say, there's work involved, and not all work's great. But as Josh has said, you give yourself to it. And I think what I've learned is it's really important to be present to everything you do. Don't be half-hearted about it. Be present to it, and be present in a way that actually respects what it is. And this is going to sound really odd. You probably want to throw me off after this. But I actually don't mind washing the dishes as long as I'm present to the water and to the dish and know actually what I'm doing in the larger scheme of things. It sounds bizarre, but I actually find doing dishes and mowing the lawns, cleaning the house, really fulfilling and deeply meaningful. So am I a nut? I don't know. There you go.
You are not a nut. I actually love doing dishes too. It's one of my spiritual disciplines.
Yeah.
My husband also loves doing dishes, for which I am thankful. So, Rick, aeronautical engineer, drumming, humanities, PhD, teaching in Bible, a lot of twists and turns here as well. What would you say to us if we're wondering, should we look for one perfect fit in life? And if we should look for a spot where we fit perfectly, why should we or shouldn't we?
Well, human beings are these wonderfully complex, amazing creatures. I'm constantly amazed at who we are, actually. And that's great because the world's like that. You're always engaging with different things at different levels. And I think most of us are multi-talented in some ways, ways that might even surprise us. And, if I look at the way the world is, God hasn't made it perfect. And I'm really pleased with that, because if it was perfect, any time it changed, it would not be perfect. I think when God made it good, that was a great decision, because it can be good, but it's got room for change and growth and development. And that just happens in people's lives, right? And you may find that being in one setting, you're kind of good at this, but you grow into another space, and then that combines. My art history informs what I do in biblical studies. So is there the one thing? I don't know. I think it's a little more dynamic than that. I mean, it's who I am, that's for sure. I'm never going to be a great basketball player, right? I'm not tall enough. But there are other things that are part of who I am where I can actually be good at a number of fields, and I think most people can. I love drumming. Still do that. 62 and drum. Had a couple of kids say that. I mean, man, that was really cool. But I also enjoy, thinking about aircraft. And I don't know if that's answering your question, but I don't know if there's a single thing. Necessarily. We find ourselves in places and we do that well.
Yeah, good. Andy, let's turn to your story. Give us that overview of where you've come from and where you're at.
Well, maybe I will give you, rather than just a strict narrative, I'll tell you about the 3 defining failures of my life, my work life. Because they really have defined in a major way my own career, and it's easy, as a speaker, for example, people introduce me based on my bio, and it sounds so awesome when people read my bio. I'm like, wow, this guy sounds very successful. That is not how it's felt to be part of my life. And just to give you a quick sense, although computer programmer was my dream when I was 10, it pretty quickly became clear that I had some gifts as a musician. And so really by the time I was in high school, I think what I wanted to do was music. And I pursued music very seriously and did end up a professional musician. But in my mid-20s, after a number of years of very intensive voice lessons, concluded that I could not sing on a regular basis without shredding my vocal cords. I have a very good voice in a very tiny range, and I worked with one of the best teachers in Boston, and I remember this day in his studio. I remember very vividly, actually, the day that my voice teacher, Merrill, said, he said, I just don't think you have the pipes. You just don't have, it's a little bit maybe like Rick finding out he can't play basketball, except my teacher and I both thought that with enough instruction I'd be able to really sing at a professional level for my whole life. And I realized I wasn't going to be able to do that. And that cut off that career path when I was 24, 25 years old. The thing I probably most loved to do, I couldn't do it as a profession. Next big failure, 10 years later, I was editing a magazine called Regeneration. I loved that work. It was, I learned a lot. I kind of fell into journalism, a little bit like Josh was in journalism. And 5 years into that, we realized we could not keep that business going. So that ran out of money. A lot of people invested in it. We had to just tell them, thank you for investing. Your money's gone. And I was out of work for 2 years. And during those 2 years, I pitched a book called Culture Making. And then this is the third failure of my life. I completely failed to write the book. I procrastinated. I was actually terrified of writing a bad book. I hit the deadline for the book, and I had, I think, 3,000 words out of 100,000 words written on the day it was due. And just found myself completely paralyzed by what I thought I was called to do, and I think I was called to do. So there is a way to narrate my story that's like the peaks of the story and the good news of the story, but really the formative things have been these disappointments, reversals, turns, failures that have been equally important in shaping whoever I am and whatever I have to offer as a writer or as a, as a friend to people.
Yeah. Wow, thanks for sharing those formative disappointments. Those are real roadblocks that you've hit. What did you do when you came up to those roadblocks, and then how to decide where to go from there?
Well, I would say I handled the third failure better than the first two. I think I learned something. To be honest, I think the first two I largely just bottled up my disappointment and maybe shame, especially in the case of the failure of the business. And actually, I was pretty depressed the year after Regeneration failed. Not in a clinical way necessarily, but just quite just slow and lethargic. And I think if I had sought out friends in a more intentional way, I would have come out of that faster. Right. With the book, what helped me be more mature about the book is I still had to turn it in. Like they had paid me in advance, and I'd spent it, so I couldn't not do it. And so I really was desperate, and I turned to two friends at a very key moment, two very long-time friends, and I asked them to pray for me. And in this really very powerful, one of the most powerful times of intercessory prayer I've ever experienced, these two friends just laid hands on me. I repented of all the foolish reasons I had not written this book. I was weeping. They imparted God's grace to me, God's forgiveness, God's empowering. And I arose from that prayer time ready to actually do the work that I was supposed to do. It was still really hard, but it was not impeded by this fundamental paralysis.
That's great.
So I think turning to those friends was the biggest decision that made that last failure actually much more fruitful than the first two were.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
I'm struck in all three of your work-related journeys by how many turns there have been for all three of you. And maybe elaborating a little bit more on what Andy was saying from his personal experience. Josh and Rick, where did you go? How did you make decisions at those crossroads when you came to them?
Josh.
That's great. It's a great question because you never run out of crossroad type questions in life. There's always some new major challenge. It might be a crisis. It might be trying to parse two great opportunities. I've heard some really good advice recently from a pastor in New York named John Tyson. And he says that we spend so much of our time thinking about, do we take this job or that job? Do we go to this graduate school or that graduate school? Or these things that we think are so weighty and that will influence and impact our lives for years and years to come. And some of them will, right? But I don't think that you can't look into the Bible and say, well, the Bible told me to go to this graduate school, right? Yeah. But when we do look at the Bible and we study what Jesus says, it's very clear that God's always asking us to spend more time with Him, to get to know Him, to read about Him, to sit down and listen to Him and talk to Him. When we do those first things, the secondary questions we have about how do we live our lives and what do we do with our work and career, those things come into greater clarity and focus when we are closest to God and walking most closely with Him. I know that it sounds maybe a little bit cliche, but I mean, it's just so true. And so when people go and ask this pastor, oh, what should I do with my life? He'll say, well, how do you spend your time?
Hmm.
Who do you go to talk to about this? Do you talk to God about this? Have you immersed yourself in the Word and really done the things that God's asked us to do? I mean, because He doesn't ask us to do very many things. He doesn't ask us to go take this particular job. He asks us to sit down, read, and pray, and share the gospel. So that's something I need to keep doing and reminding myself to do.
Thanks, Josh. That's really rich. How would we take this a step forward? What are some ways that we could know when it's time to leave a job or transition? What are some indicators that it would be a good time to make a transition? That can go to anyone. What do we think?
Well, maybe I'll just pick up after Josh, just to reflect on my own journey about when I felt it was time to move on. I've been struck by the fact that when God appoints Saul as king, the first king Israel has, and you're thinking, okay, what does the king do? And God says to Saul, whatever your hand finds to do, do it. And I think there's a real sense of freedom there about trusting that actually God is a good dad, and it's like there are all these trees in the garden, go for it, right? But this one, keep away from. This is not good for you. But the others, off you go. And I feel we ought to take that seriously. So, do what you love. I think there's something to that. Now, the thing that gives you life that you're interested in, just pursue it, right? And, trust that God will be good enough to lead you if this is a problem. So I guess I've kind of lived with that confidence. And for me, the hallmarks have been, here I am working in engineering, I'm enjoying that. And I start to find something else that I find, I'm thinking about ideas and history of culture. I'm finding, well, that's really exciting. I'm attracted to that. And so I begin to study it. And then, okay, am I in the right place? And I'd say at this point, where a lot of us get into trouble, this is to pick up on Andy's point, we're pretty much lone rangers. And I would say that, I talk to students a lot and they're talking about, well, should I go on and do a PhD program? And then I talk to them, well, what about your local church, your friends, the people who indwell this place with you where you really do understand being made in God's image? And I'm amazed at the number of people who are just lonely. They haven't opened up their lives to people. They've not actually gone through those deep times like Andy talked about, it being vulnerable, where you're transparent, and where people can know you. And I found that incredibly helpful at these critical turning points, to be in a group of people who know me. And, I've been vulnerable with them, open with them. They're listening to the Holy Spirit. Josh was talking about that, praying. Take that seriously. And I think out of that, you find that God leads you in ways that are sometimes almost so natural, which has been our journey. Most of my big decisions have not been ones where I've heard a voice from heaven or something. One or two have been a little bit like that, almost literally. But often it's just been, what's the thing you love to do? Let that guide you and reflect God's character as you do it.
Wow, that's so good.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. Let's incorporate a question from our Twitter feed. We've got at Will Rogan, who has a question for us coming from Long Beach, California. And his question is, can you tell a story of what it looks like when someone really gets it and indwells the biblical story in such a way that it would change their work? Andy, what do you think about that?
Wow. Well, I think about a film that I helped to produce, just executive produce, which means I didn't actually do anything, but my name goes on the end, just to be clear. It was directed by a friend of mine named Nate Clark, and it's actually about a woodworker named Harrison Higgins in Richmond, Virginia. It's one of the films we did for This Is Our City, one of Christianity Day's projects. And Harrison makes this extraordinary furniture. He makes both replicas of the best of furniture from the kind of finest woodworking traditions, but he also makes very modern furniture. And what strikes me, what is just amazing when you meet this gentleman, is how deeply his reflection on the nature of God's creation, and specifically God's creation of trees, which are the source of, obviously, furniture and cabinetry and so forth, has given him this reverence for the materials he uses. And so it's led him to make to work very hard at quality, because he quotes at the end of this little film, he quotes Wendell Berry, who says, in order to live on the earth, we have to break the earth's body and drink its blood. It's quite a vivid, kind of startling statement. We have to consume out of this world. And he says we can either do that thoughtlessly and heedlessly, and in that case it's a sacrilege, or we can do it thoughtfully, carefully, reverently, and it's a sacrament. And when you watch Harrison at work in his shop, and the folks that he trains, the artisans and apprentices that he employs, there's this kind of reverence toward the things that they're making. Now, not all of us, have the luxury of being such incredibly artisanal. I mean, I know everybody wants to be artisanal. I understand there are artisanal websites now, and whatever. But not all of us can do that quite so directly. But just seeing someone who had been so transformed by his understanding of who God was, who he was, that every day when he opens up his shop, he's working in a different way and producing stuff that just visually has this extraordinary quality to it. To me, it was very moving.
That's awesome. That's a great example. I have a couple of questions for us, maybe on the hard topics of sort of the unknown and the fear. So for many of us, there's a lot of fear around making a wrong choice into this unknown at a crossroads. Josh, what do you think? Where do you think are the roots of that fear? What would you do to address it?
I think fear is often grounded in anxiety and insecurity and around identity. We place all of our identity in our work product, in how our bosses view us, how our colleagues view us, how customers experience our product. I think we then put so much pressure on this trajectory of success. What does my resume look like, right? As opposed to what does my eulogy look like? And I think if we put so much effort into how the world perceives us, as opposed to nurturing our understanding of how our identity is rooted in God's creation of us. I think if we are grounded in that security and that confidence, I think you lose some of the fear and anxiety about our work and our identity in work.
That's really good. That sentence really strikes me. What does my resume look like versus what does my eulogy look like?
Yeah.
Wow.
Good. Yeah.
That's convicting.
Something's very helpful.
I stole it from someone else.
Something that's been very helpful for me on fear, I think I heard this from the writer Amy Julia Becker, that fear anxiety is rooted in imagining the future without Christ present in it. When we're anxious, we are projecting into, in our mind's eye or heart, into a future where Christ is not present. And being able to see that in my own life and realizing, oh my goodness, that's exactly what I do. I play out this scenario, forgetting that whatever happens, Christ is going to be present to me. If I lose this job, if my business fails, if my book doesn't sell, or I never get it written, Christ will be present to me in that situation. And I think that practicing the presence of Christ in my future, as well as in my present, actually can help sort of rob that fear of its power. It's never going to go away entirely, but it can sort of rob it of its ability to control and limit us.
Yeah. Convicting. I'm curious to know what you all think a little bit about whether we're even sort of asking the right question here when it comes to, can you do what you love? How does a question like this speak to those who are maybe less passionate than others and they just aren't sure what it is that they love? Maybe that's not their personality, or maybe are we applying this question across professions where it's not realistic to be elated by your work? What do you think about that? That could go to anyone on the panel.
Anyone? Yeah. Well, sure. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think Josh was saying this earlier that if I'm thinking about a marriage is not going to work if it's only based on passion. It's not going to work. Love is a different kind of thing. And, love is a commitment even when things are not working out so well. So there might be people who are actually loving their work and don't realize it in a strange kind of way. I wonder, too, if the business about passion, people might... A very good friend of mine, Debbie Erickson, raised some of these questions with me. Very helpful, Debbie. Well, I'm not a passionate person, and that might be true. It might also be that I've never actually found something that's made me passionate, or I've never actually given myself permission to be passionate. I might have grown up in an environment where, well, I go to church and there's a certain way I worship God. These are obviously kind of very down-to-earth illustrations, but we all talk about them. I go watch my local football team and I'm leaping about all over the place, but you don't do that in the presence of God. You want to be nice and quiet and sedate. So I wonder if there's a freedom, too, that some of us have to discover, and it's that this idea of the world that God has given us. Andy, you mentioned your friend the woodworker, and to see all of life as a gift. How would that change things? We're just having wonderful spring here at Regent, and I walk out in the morning and I look up through the trees, the sun, through the dappled leaves, and you look small and you just see how amazing this is. There's so much extraordinary beauty in the world, and somehow it gets missed. So maybe my particular form of work, I've done some work that's pretty soul-destroying. So I don't want to say all work necessarily is going to be wonderfully passionate and engaging. But I wonder, too, if there's a matter of just changing our perception of this. Take the dish again. To see the dish that I'm washing, someone's actually made that. And maybe I should stop at this point, but one other comment that's related to it. North America, come the summer, and what do you see? Just about, out the front of everybody's place are last year's plastic lawn chairs. Horrible, decrepit, that they're trying to sell. And part of me thinks, if you'd actually spend a bit more and got a wonderful teak table, putting all this junk, you'd actually be paying for somebody to make something they believed in, and when you looked out on your back veranda, you'd see something of value and wonder. You'd have less of it, which probably wouldn't hurt, but what you had would be quality.
Wow.
What does that mean to treat life like that? What does it mean to treat every moment, to be present to it as a gift? To see it's something that's not primarily about me, that's larger than me. I wonder if that would unleash in a lot of us something to do with love and passion that we haven't quite understood. And Jesus can go to the cross, probably not a very enjoyable experience, but with a passion and a love. What does that mean? I've gone over my 1.5 minutes, but just some, thoughts maybe? I don't know.
Wow. Paige, you're asking that question helps me surface something, which is I have been a little uneasy with the title of this hangout. Can you do what you love? And I just figured out what it is. The word love is a relational word. Yeah. There are two loves that are kind of primary for human beings. We're meant to love God, our Maker, and we're meant to love other people. And here we are using this word. I mean, of course, we use it so broadly. It's used for all kinds of things. But here we are using it for essentially a somewhat impersonal thing, my work, which is not a person. And I almost wonder I think there's two dangers here. One is that loving my work really becomes about self-love. Yeah. I think some people, how, by way of analogy, you sometimes get the sense when you're in certain cities, like New York, for example, certain fashionable parts of New York, that as people walk down the street, they're sort of noticing themselves in the reflection from the windows of the stores or shops or whatever, and like, oh yeah, here I am. I'm in New York. I look pretty good. And you realize that part of what they're doing is they're using New York as a backdrop for their self-regard and their self-curation in a way. And I think we're tempted to do that with our work and to sort of watch ourselves in the mirror as we work and say, oh, I have such a cool job. It is so artisanal. I mean, I just, wow. I think that's idolatrous, right?
Yeah, indeed.
To flip it around, though, I think you can love your work if in your work you find a way to love people and love God.
Yep.
That's what we're here for, ultimately. And we are indeed, I mean, I don't want to take anything back we've said about the value of vocation and image-bearing and work and so forth, but ultimately it needs to be ordered to the love of God and people. And most work involves other people. I was thinking about, what about a very solitary job like being a night security guard, which I think would be a tough job. Lots of people have to take that job, probably millions of people around the world. That is the only job that's open to them.
I've done that too.
What were you going to say, Rick?
I've done that too.
You've done it, yeah.
Yeah, I know what it's like. Yeah.
Well, can I ask, how did you manage to love it in any way, or was there anything redeeming about it?
Well, actually, you know what I found was just walking around the place in the quiet.
Yeah.
And having this sense of tending it when no one else was there.
Wow.
It sounds odd, but it was like, this is really odd. It sounded like it was a precious thing. Everyone else had left it, and it was in my hands just for that night to make sure that the next morning there'd be something there. That sounds weird, but it made it a very different experience, actually. I was shepherding it during the night. How does that sound?
I think that's amazing. and I think we would tend to think, oh, that would be, what drudgery. I couldn't possibly love being a security guard. But I think what you're illustrating is if your loves are oriented properly, you love God who's with you in the night, you love your neighbor who will work there the next day. Yeah. Even these things that seem unlovable can be lovable.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right.
Thanks for expanding on that. That's tremendous. I want to bring in one of our live audience members. His name is Alan Boussard, and he's won a spot to ask his question on air live by submitting it in advance. Alan's joining us from Slovakia today. Alan, why don't you go ahead and ask your question to one of the panelists?
So thank you very much for the opportunity. My question is, does this question about loving work, how does it work for the millions of people, hundreds of millions of people around the world who are just really in a daily struggle for survival? Is it a question that only we rich people can even think to ask? Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Alan. Andy, what do you think?
Well, it's such a good question, and I think in one sense, absolutely. If what's behind the topic here is how do I choose the most fulfilling path, I venture to say, 60–80% of humanity alive today that's not a question that comes up when they think of work. They are trying to provide for their family, keep a roof over their head, put food on the table, and the question of fulfillment in their work per se simply is not something that's open. I mean, these guys, in this Turkish mine that had this terrible explosion, those guys are not wake up in the morning and say, oh, I could be an artisanal woodworker or I could go dig for coal. They can only dig for coal. That being said, I think this reframing we've been doing the last few minutes helps maybe clarify that while option in work is a tremendous privilege that is not widely available, the option to love my neighbor and love God as I work is available. There's a sociologist, I'm sorry, or anthropologist, I think, I forget her name here on the spot, but she studied fast food workers in Harlem, in New York City, a few years ago. And she chose this cohort to study because she thought, well, this would just be the worst possible job. How do people survive in this job, working in McDonald's or Burger King up, way up in very poor parts of New York? She actually found that these workers found tremendous fulfillment in their work, not because it's great work. I mean, it's totally routinized. You have no freedom to make any choices at all. You're just following, the pattern, very busy. But what they found fulfillment in was in their relationships with their coworkers, and they actually reported very high levels of satisfaction, and she was very taken aback by how much fulfillment they found. So, yeah, if we treat it as, which of my many career paths will bring me fulfillment, that's quite a privileged question. Not that it's wrong to ask it or to be responsible with that privilege that you have, but if the question is, how can I love my neighbor and love God, I actually think that applies to everyone, even in the most demanding, difficult conditions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I used to actually, part of this journey of going through university, I used to work as a roofing tile labourer in a roofing tile factory in Australia. And I was surrounded by a group of new Italian immigrants who'd come from southern Italy. And it was. I look back on it, and it was really hard manual work. Right? We're lifting all this heavy stuff all the time, and but we had such a sense of camaraderie. And when we sat down for morning tea, out came the food, and of course they had morning teas with the fresh bread. And it sounds weird, but I look back at that as some of the happiest moments in my working life.
Wow.
Just because, as you said, Andy, the celebration of friendship. That it wasn't actually all about the tiles. We did that. But the fun bit was all the banter and the laughter that went on as we were doing all of this, and it actually made it. But maybe there's a reason why people sing in boats when they're rowing.
Thanks, Rick. Let's have our second live audience member join us. Her name is Rebecca Pruitt, and she's joining us right here in Vancouver. Rebecca, why don't you go ahead and ask your question to the panelists?
Hi there. Specifically, Rick, we've talked about some of us don't have opportunities to pursue specifically meaningful work because it's just a matter of doing work to survive. But some of us do have the flexibility to do that, but may find ourselves on work that doesn't feel particularly meaningful or enriching. How do we navigate, on the one hand, contentment and just recognizing that this has been provided for us in this time, but also complacency and not wanting to be complacent and potentially move on to something else?
Yeah. That's a great question. And in some ways I can really only answer it from my own experience. When I was at university and working part-time, one of the jobs I had was actually in a manufacturing plant. And they did a lot of anodizing of parts, and they used these racks. And of course the racks would eventually get eaten by the acid baths, etc. And my particular job was to work in this grungy little old shed on my own, and my whole 8-hour day was about taking these racks that had half corroded rivets. I'd have to bang the rivets out, usually take off half my knuckle as well, and re-rivet it. That was just some of the most soul-destroying work I've ever done. And looking back on it, I think it was because it was so lonely. And to be fair to the employers, I was a temp. The people who actually worked there, they would rotate them through so people wouldn't do this all the time on their own. It was pretty miserable, and I felt really quite depressed by it. It was my friends that helped me. I was one of those people that really looked forward to the weekend. I didn't get any joy out of going to work, I have to tell you. But I think what got me out of that was actually beginning to say, I need to take a risk. And I thought, I'm going to make a bit of a life-changing decision here. It's going to put me out on a limb. But I remember distinctly talking to the Lord about that and saying, you know what, Lord, this is not bringing life to me. I think there's an opportunity. I'm just going to trust you and have a shot and see what happens. And I talked to some friends about it, and I just jumped and took it, and it partly led to where I am now. So that's not everyone's experience, I know that. And I can only really talk from my own. I think ultimately, in the end, if you don't have someone who's beyond the sun, if you're stuck in Ecclesiastes, where it's all the same stuff over and over again, that's terribly soul-destroying. And in the end, the body just gives up, right? So it talks about that at the end of Ecclesiastes, where the lights grow dim, the sound of grinding grows low, which is you lose your teeth, all that kind of stuff. Ultimately, in the end, as I think Josh and Andy have been saying, our sense of meaning and purpose can only really be found in the one who lives on the other side of the sun, if you like, right? The one who's beyond that, namely God. And so for people who are suffering with painful disabilities, chronic pain, right? They can't do the things they want to. Yep, you try and make the best of it. It's still not great. Ultimately, for a believer, is the sure and certain hope of the world to come. It's not forever. This will end. There will be a world that's made new with all kinds of possibility being opened. And I don't think that's the opiate of the people, because the resurrection happened. And because it happened, that really, I think, in the end, can give us something to look forward to and give us the hope that even in messy situations. Now, as I say that can sound really easy and cheap for me to say because I'm doing quite well, and so I'm sorry about that. I probably should say that with a lot more humility. And I'm not the one who was raised from the dead either, so maybe he would say that to us, and he's got some grounds to say it that I don't have.
Yeah. Thank you, Rick. I think that is the perfect note for us to conclude on, actually, is that humble statement. I am so appreciative to our panelists for engaging in this discussion with us today. We could have talked about this, I think, for 10 hours instead of one. A lot of good questions. Thank you to our audience members for submitting some questions, and especially to Rebecca and Alan for being willing to ask those with us live on air. This has been Can You Do What You Love, which is the Regent Redux event sponsored by Christianity Today and Regent College. I apologize we couldn't get to all the questions that came in. If you would like to direct your lingering questions to Andy, Rick, Josh, or myself, our contact info is posted for you on the regentredux.net site. And if you would like to get some more free resources on this topic of meaningful work, we'd love to send you some. Please sign up for the emails there at regentredux.net. We'll also be posting the recording of this conversation there in just a few hours as well, if you'd like to share it with your friends if it's been meaningful to you, as we hope it has been. I'd like to ask one thing of our viewers before we sign off, and that is, can you help us out by sharing your feedback with us? It will be such a help for us to make Regent Redux a stronger event in the future if we're able to hear what your experience was like. So we've designed a short survey. It'll be tweeted out from at Regent College. It'll be on our Facebook page, and it'll be emailed to those who signed up for Redux emails. And we would really appreciate your help with that to make it better for folks in the future. Speaking of Regent Redux in the future, our next event will be this fall, and it'll be on the topic of focusing on spiritual disciplines and spiritual practices in the midst of the busyness of our technologically driven world. Definitely another relevant topic for us coming in the fall, so you won't want to miss that. Sign up for the updates through the Regent World at regentredux.net to hear the latest on that event as it comes together. Huge thanks to Christianity Today and to Regent College for putting this event together and for letting me talk in the library, which has been quite a privilege. So thanks so much, everyone. That wraps up our lunchtime discussion today, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
See you later.
Thank you.